The United States is offering some tariff relief to Canadian steel and aluminum producers, but there is a significant catch. They must move production to the United States.
50%. That is the tariff rate now sitting on Canadian steel and aluminum entering the United States. Not 25, 50. And this week, the Trump administration published a formal notice in the Federal Register telling Canadian companies directly that they can make it all go away. All they have to do is pack up and move to America.
The poaching protocol,
because what it means,
Trump's steel ultimatum versus the Carney pivot, the hand in the fridge. What is becoming impossible to ignore is that the neighbor has finally realized their hand is still in our fridge, and now they're trying to bolt the entire kitchen to the floor and drag it across the border.
And the question of whether a country gets to keep the industries it spent a century building, or whether they can be taken with a signature. Here's what happened. On Thursday, the U.S. Department of Commerce opened a formal process in the Federal Register. The notice lays it out clearly. Canadian and Mexican steel and aluminum companies can apply for immediate tariff relief on their shipments into the United States. The catch, they have to commit to moving production south of the border, not eventually, not maybe. They have to submit evidence that they are investing in new capacity inside the United States, and in return, their tariff rate drops from 50% down to 25%, and that is the deal. Move your factory, and we will cut your penalty in half. Now, this next part, I had to read it twice. This is not a suggestion. This is not a press conference talking point. This is a published federal process with submission requirements, documentation standards, and a formal review by the Commerce Department under Secretary Howard Lutnick. This is industrial recruitment disguised as trade policy. International trade lawyer William Pellerin called it exactly what it is, and a very aggressive tactic by the United States. And then he said something that I think captures the entire philosophy behind this move. He said it reinforces the American approach of, we win if you lose. That is not spin. That is a legal expert reading the actual document and telling you what it says between the lines. In the Oval Office the same day, Trump himself framed it as momentum. Car companies are coming from Canada, he said. They're coming from Mexico, Germany, Japan. He is talking about this like it is already happening.
This week, the mask didn't just slip. It was torn off in the Federal Register. The Trump administration has officially transitioned from trade friction to a campaign of industrial poaching, offering Canadian steel and aluminum producers a deal, move your factories to the U.S., or pay a 50% penalty for the crime of staying in Canada. This is nuts. It's not a trade policy. It's a kidnapping attempt. They're telling our companies, abandon your roots, abandon your workers, and move south, and we'll only tax you 25%.
That is the deal. I spent 3 hours going through the actual documents, and what I found changes how you read this entire story. Because this is not really about steel. This is not really about aluminum. This is about leverage. And the question is, does Canada have any? The answer, it turns out, is more interesting than you might think. But before I get to that, you need to understand what Canada has already done in response, because it is not nothing. And it sets up the most important part of this story.
It doesn't mean anything to us because it's an unfeasible proposal for the aluminum sector.
Where we left off, the U.S. had just laid its cards on the table. Move here or pay 50%. Now here is where my jaw dropped. Because while most people were focused on the American offer this week, almost nobody connected it to the counter strategy Canada has been quietly building for months. And once you see it, the whole picture changes. Prime Minister Carney did not wait for this week's announcement to react. What Carney seems to be doing, and this is fascinating, is building a wall of his own. Not a physical one, an economic one. And the foundation was laid back in November when he announced a suite of measures specifically designed to protect Canada's steel and lumber sectors from exactly this kind of pressure. Here's what those measures look like. First, Canada slashed its tariff rate quotas for steel imports from countries without a free trade agreement, cutting them from 50% of 2024 levels.
It's a bad trade. It's a we win, you lose philosophy written in federal ink. Trump calls it momentum. I call it a desperate shoplifting spree because they can't compete with our efficiency. MarkCarney didn't just fire back, he dismantled the entire premise. While George Conway and the legal experts in D.C. are calling this an unprecedented aggressive tactic, the view from Ottawa is much simpler.
It was Carney saying, we are done subsidizing our dependency on you. I want to be fair here. Letting that remission expire hurts Canadian manufacturers too, at least in the short term. Over 60% of the steel used by Canadian manufacturers in 2024 was imported. Cutting off tariff relief on that supply means higher input costs for Canadian factories. That is real pain. But the strategic logic behind it is clear, and this is where the analysis gets interesting. The reason this move matters is because it is not reactive. It is part of a deliberate restructuring of Canada's industrial supply chain. For decades, Canada's trade has been overwhelmingly concentrated on a single partner. More than 75% of all Canadian exports go to the United States. For steel, that number is 90%. For aluminum, 90%. For lumber, 90%. That level of dependency means every tariff, every policy shift, every political mood swing in Washington directly hits Canada's bottom line. So when Carney tightens quotas and ends remissions, what he is really doing is forcing a pivot. He is creating conditions where Canadian manufacturers have to start buying Canadian steel, not because they want to, but because the economics now favor it. According to the government's own estimates, these measures could unlock over $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel alone. That is not a rounding error, that is a structural shift. Now, I actually understand why Trump made this offer.
This isn't strength. It's frustration. The bellow, the bully, the fold. The playbook being run by the Commerce Department is transparent. It relies on a 3-act cycle designed to create an industrial exodus. They bellow with 50% tariffs to shock the markets, they bully with formal poaching notices in the Federal Register, and they believe we'll fold before we realize they have no alternative to our supply.
It does not mean Canada loses money on aluminum. It means American manufacturers who need Canadian aluminum now pay 50% more for it. That cost gets passed to the car you buy, the building being constructed downtown, the beverage can in your hand, and the numbers on this are stark. The U.S. International Trade Commission found that a $2.8 billion production increase in industries protected by steel and aluminum tariffs was offset by a $3.4 billion production decrease in downstream industries affected by higher input costs. Read that again. The protection created less value than it destroyed. The Can Manufacturers Institute put it bluntly. These tariffs keep costs high to make metal cans in America, while keeping costs low to import canned goods from foreign competitors. I didn't believe this at first either, but the ratio is devastating. Steel-consuming jobs in the United States outnumber steel-producing jobs by roughly 80-1. The American steel industry employs around 83,000 people. The industries that use steel as an input employ 6.5 million. So when you raise the price of steel to protect 83,000 jobs, you are raising costs for 6.5 million. Does this actually help American workers or just the headlines?
They suck at long-term planning, so they're trying to buy ours. Howard Lutnick is out there acting like he's doing us a favor by cutting a penalty in half. 25% is still a shakedown. They think they can use the sucking sound of their own subsidies to drain our talent. It's amateur hour.
Sends a very strong message to the US that by far, especially with the Middle East situation, Canada remains the safest and most secure source of supply for a very demanding market that needs metal day and night to supply their manufacturing sector.
This flew completely under the radar. While everyone has been fixated on the US-Canada tariff fight, the European Union quietly erected what trade analysts are calling a carbon wall. And for Canadian aluminum and steel producers, it might be the best thing that has happened in years. On January 1st of this year, the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, known as CBAM, moved from its transitional reporting phase into full enforcement. What that means in plain language is this. Starting now, any company importing steel, aluminum, cement, or fertilizer into Europe has to pay a carbon levy based on the emissions embedded in those products. The price is linked to the EU's carbon trading system, which is currently running around 85 euros per ton of CO2.
They're trying to recruit an industry they physically cannot sustain without our power grid. And before we break this down further, subscribe to Canada Policy for clear, in-depth analysis on the moments shaping Canada's future. The American side believes an industrial ecosystem can be moved with a signature. They are wrong. Canada's steel and aluminum advantage is built on hard assets that are physically embedded in our landscape.
Which is mostly produced using coal-fired power, generates roughly 16 tons of CO2 per ton. Under CBM, that difference is not just an environmental talking point, it is a price advantage. European importers looking at Canadian aluminum will face a fraction of the CBAM cost compared to what they would pay for Chinese or Middle Eastern metal. Canada is not just cleaner, Canada is cheaper. in the one market that now prices carbon into every transaction. I'll be honest, when I first read this, I thought it was a mistake. 3%. That is how much of Canada's aluminum exports went to the EU in 2023. 90% went to the United States, 3% to Europe. That sounds like nothing. But that 3% is about to become the most strategically important number in Canadian trade policy. Because CBM does not just open a door, it rolls out a red carpet for low-carbon producers. And Canada is not just low-carbon, it is the lowest-carbon major aluminum producer in the world. Now let me give you the other side, just because it is important. The U.S. strategy is not irrational. From Washington's perspective, this is about industrial self-sufficiency. The national security argument for domestic steel and aluminum production is real. You do not want to depend on foreign suppliers for the metals that build your military hardware, your infrastructure, your grid. I try to see both sides. And on this one, both sides have a point, but one has the numbers.
Specifically, Quebec's hydroelectricity and the Great Lakes manufacturing corridor. You can't move a river. 96% of our aluminum runs on clean, abundant water. They want us to move to Ohio, to Alabama, to run on a grid that's gasping for air and burning coal? This is unfeasible. We have the lowest carbon footprint on Earth.
A similar playbook, but with a structural advantage Mexico never had, and the world's cleanest aluminum and a carbon pricing regime that is about to reward exactly that. The EU's decision in December 2025 to expand CBAM to cover 180 downstream products, everything from pipes and structural steel to household appliances, means the advantage is not just on raw materials, it extends through the entire value chain. And with primary aluminum production in mainland Europe likely to decline over the coming years, there is roughly 2 million tons of capacity that needs to be replaced. Russia, once a major supplier, may never be fully trusted in European markets again. Iceland and Norway are largely tapped out. Canada, with its hydro-powered smelters and duty-free access under CETA, is positioned to fill that gap. On February 6th of this year, the Canadian government formally added aluminum to Quebec's list of critical and strategic minerals. That is not a symbolic gesture. It unlocks targeted government support, faster permitting, and potential incentives under Canada's critical minerals strategy.
You can't replicate that in the Midwest. They're asking our companies to leave the 21st century and move back to the 19th. It's a loser's deal.
50%. The tariff rate on Canadian steel and aluminum entering the United States. I told you it would change everything. And now you can see why. Because 50% is not just a tax. It is a fork in the road. It is the number that forces every Canadian steel and aluminum company to make a choice. Stay and fight, or leave and lose everything that made you competitive in the first place. Now connect this to what we talked about earlier. See the pattern? The U.S. offers tariff relief in exchange for relocation. Canada responds by tightening its own market, forcing domestic demand, and cutting interprovincial freight rates by 50% to make it cheaper to move Canadian steel across Canada.
This is the mutual symbiosis Washington refuses to acknowledge. The U.S. defense sector and their automotive green revolution cannot function without Canadian low-carbon inputs. By trying to poach the plants, they are admitting they lack the structural resilience to build their own. The Federal Register is clear. Invest in U.S. capacity, and your tariff rate drops significantly.
It is not a business decision. It is an industrial fantasy, and the Canadian government knows it. That is why the counter strategy is not defensive, it is offensive. The Buy Canadian policy now requires Canadian steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber in all federal contracts over $25 million. The 50% freight rate discount on interprovincial shipments means Canadian producers can serve domestic markets more cheaply. The work-sharing program, backed by over $100 million, is designed to keep skilled workers employed while companies restructure. And the $500 million top-up to the softwood lumber loan facility provides the liquidity that companies need to survive the transition without capitulating. Where do you think this goes from here? Because honestly, I am not sure anyone knows. But here is what the data suggests. If the tariff structure stays in place through 2027, and there is no indication it will be rolled back, Canada's export profile will look fundamentally different in 2 years. The EU's CBAM is only getting stricter. Free carbon allowances are being phased out through 2034. By 2028, the expansion to 180 downstream products will be fully in force. That means the carbon premium on low-emission metals will only grow. For Canadian producers, the window to pivot is not next year. It is now. The U.S. Trade Commission's own data tells a story that should concern anyone paying attention in Washington. The tariffs designed to protect American metal production cost downstream industries more than they saved upstream. 83,000 steel jobs supported by tariffs, 6.5 million steel-consuming jobs exposed to higher costs. The math does not lie. And while those 83,000 jobs make for great campaign talking points, the 6.5 million do not fit on a bumper sticker. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I want to know if you feel the same way. This week, the United States formally asked Canadian companies to abandon the cleanest, cheapest aluminum production system in the world and relocate to a country where the same metal would cost more to produce, generate more emissions, and still face a 25% tariff. The industry said it was unfeasible. The trade lawyers said it was aggressive. The data says it does not add up. And yet, this is the offer on the table. Canada is not standing still. Our trade infrastructure is being rewired in real time. New domestic demand, new European pathways, new carbon advantages that did not exist 5 years ago. The old dependency is not gone, but the architecture of something new is being built. Whether it works depends on execution, on timing, and on whether the political will holds, but the strategy itself, hedge, diversify, build from strength, that is not hope. That is math. And right now, the math is starting to favor the side with the cleaner grid, the cheaper power, and the longer game. To one customer and hopes that customer stays friendly, that model is breaking. And what is replacing it is something more resilient, more diversified, and potentially more valuable. But it is going to hurt in the transition. Let me steelman the other argument for a second, because even then, it falls short. The case for moving to the United States is straightforward. Access to the world's largest consumer market, lower energy costs in some regions, proximity to manufacturing hubs. If you are a steel company and your entire customer base is in Michigan and Ohio, moving closer makes business sense. In fairness, there is a logic to this. But here is where the logic breaks down. The energy advantage that Canadian aluminum producers have is not marginal. Hydroelectric power in Quebec costs a fraction of what natural gas costs in the American South, and the carbon advantage in the thing that used to be a nice to have is now a competitive requirement in Europe's $12 trillion economy. You cannot move hydro dams. You cannot replicate a century of infrastructure, and you cannot fake a 2-ton carbon footprint when the global average is 12. Let me translate this into something concrete. Canada's aluminum industry supports 29,500 direct and indirect jobs. It generates over $12 billion in annual exports. Quebec alone accounts for 60% of all aluminum production in North America, across 9 operating smelters. The largest single smelter, Alouette in Sept-Îles, produces over 600,000 tons per year. These are not pop-up operations that can be loaded onto trucks. These are massive, capital-intensive facilities built over